10 years after his good friend Henry David Thoreau died at just the age of 44, Bronson Alcott, who some of you may know was the father of the Little Women author Louisa May Alcott, took his friend Mary Newberry Adams, because everyone apparently back then went by 3 names, because Ralph Waldo Emerson was also a good friend, but that's a different story. So Bronson Alcott took his friend Mary Adams, who was visiting from out of town. He took her to see Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts, where Thoreau had built a cabin to live, work, and write some of the greatest examples of early American prose, if you've ever read it. But when they got there, the cabin had already been gone and dismantled, and when Mary saw that there was nothing there to mark where the cabin once stood, she suggested that they build a cairn. Now, a cairn is a stack of rocks like that. She suggested that they build this cairn to honor Thoreau, with the hope and the expectation that others who also loved Thoreau would add a stone. So she placed the first rock, then Bronson added the second. And so it began. Since then, for almost 150 years, people have brought stones from all over the world, or other natural tokens like feathers and nuts and flowers, have brought them to this clearing on the banks of Walden Pond, near where Thoreau built his cabin, and they have filled this clearing with cairns upon cairns. This is a picture I took about 1.5 years ago, after I added my own stone to the stack. And it's hard to imagine a more fitting tribute and memorial to a man who in the first chapter of Walden expressed his preference for natural stone above stone that is hammered for the sake of nation building. This is what he wrote. To what end, pray, is so much stone hammered? Nations are possessed with an insane ambition to perpetuate the memory of themselves by the amount of hammered stone they leave. I love better to see stones in place. The stones of Thoreau's ever-changing and unofficial memorial are placed in a way that begs for a story, an explanation of how and why these stones came to be there. Because that's the whole point of a cairn like this. A stack of rocks is both natural and unnatural in the same moment. Stacking stones like this is a way to keep the story alive. See, a stack of stones in and of themselves isn't anything more than a curiosity, but it's an invitation to ask, what's up with that stack of rocks? And these stacks of rocks, they don't tell a prescribed story, like the stories that are told by stones hammered out to promote a particular agenda. Instead, these stacks of stone invite you to participate in the ongoing story. First, to ask for the story and hear it for yourself. And then, once you've heard it and become part of that story, you join those who tell the story to others as they come along. This is the focus of the scripture we heard from Joshua just a little bit ago. 40 years after leaving Egypt, the Israelites are finally about to enter the promised land. There's just one more obstacle in front of them. It's the Jordan River. That probably looked a lot like our rivers do now because it was the flood season. So the Jordan River was swollen and overflowing its banks. This is the last obstacle between the Israelites and the promised land. But they're not worried because God has a plan. So God commands Joshua the faithful spy from several stories ago, and the newly promoted leader of the Israelites now that Moses has died. God commands Joshua to have the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant through the midst of the people, through the camp, to the very edges of the river. And when the feet of the priests touch the water, God says God will make the river stop flowing. The priests are then to enter this dry riverbed with the people following. And the priests are to stand there in the middle of the river holding the Ark of the Covenant as everyone passes by. And as they pass by, 12 people were given the command to gather stones. 12 stones. And once all the people are passed and all 12 stones are gathered, then the priests are to bring the Ark of the Covenant out of the river, and God will release the waters to flow again. This is a pretty straightforward plan. But it takes 2 chapters to go through this plan in the book of Joshua. And if you look at the full story that starts way back in the beginning of chapter 3 and goes all the way through the end of chapter 4, you'll find, you saw it even a little bit in the passage that we read, that there's some awkward repetitions and some few inconsistencies. Now, this kind of storytelling is actually pretty common in the Hebrew Bible. It suggests that the version of the story we have now is the result of several slightly different versions of the same story that have been stitched together. Now, this makes sense, especially for this story that we read this morning. Because if you think about it, in the story itself is the command to tell this story. God has given the command to the people that they are to construct a memorial and to tell the story. A whole nation was commanded to tell the story. Imagine that. A whole nation, all 12 tribes of Israel, told to remember and to tell the story of what happened on the banks of the Jordan River. So it's no wonder that different versions took shape and were passed down among the different tribes. Some tribes would have emphasized this detail over this detail. Some would have highlighted their own role as opposed to what this other tribe's ancestor did. They all had their own way of telling the story. And at some point, someone or a group of someones took all of these slightly different versions and compiled them into one story, the one story that we have now. And this is not uncommon, like I said. It's the same principle that you see at work in the 4 Gospels. Slightly different versions of the same story, except that with the Gospels, the stitched together version never really gained much traction. So we kept our 4 individual stories. That's your little biblical studies lesson for today. I always try and sneak one in. That one's it. But I share this idea with you because it raises the important issue about how we, the people, tell different versions of our shared experiences, depending on the tribes that we come from, our locality, our gender, our age, our race, our orientation, our ethnicity, our religion, our socioeconomic status. The list can go on and on about all the different tribes that we're part of. All these literally and figuratively color how we experience the world, which leads us to tell very different stories about our history. There's been a lot of talk about memorials and monuments in the news recently. A lot of discussion about the particular stories that these monuments and memorials tell and the histories that they glorify. If you watch the news, you might know that right now there are around 700 Confederate monuments in our country, not all of them in the South. And that's not counting all the roads and the schools and the libraries and the other buildings named after Confederate heroes. But for right now, since we're talking about memorials and monuments, just talking about those 700 statues. If you've read the news, that you know that there's arguments for and against removing these statues. And one of those major arguments against removing these statues has been an appeal to history, to remember our history. But the problem with that is that our history is not so straightforward or one-sided. Our history as a people and as a nation is multivalent and very complex. It's as painful as it is powerful. It's as troubling as it is inspiring. This is our legacy. This is our history. And one of the most surprising and eye-opening things, at least for me, to come out of all these discussions and disagreements about what to do with these monuments has been to learn about the history of when most of them were erected. Some of you may have heard this, but according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there were two major time periods when the bulk of these Confederate monuments were built. These two blocks of time roughly coincide with the 50th and 100th anniversaries of the Civil War. But that wasn't all that was going on in our country when these hammered stones and metalled monuments went up and were dedicated to much fanfare. The first period of prolific memorialization was from 1906 to 1912, when Jim Crow laws were being passed left and right. During this time, there was also a dramatic resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and so many Klan leaders were invited to speak at the dedication ceremonies of these statues. This is our history. The second surge of Confederate monument construction was another show of white supremacy flexing its muscle in the late 1950s and 60s as the civil rights was gaining momentum. Nations are possessed with an insane ambition to perpetuate the memory of themselves by the amount of hammered stone they leave. Thoreau's words echo back to us, and they reverberate off the hammered stone and metal monuments erected to perpetuate a history of white supremacy and racial violence. The stones that we set up matter deeply. They matter because they point to stories that beg to be told. The stories that we tell have the power of life or death in them. The Israelites were a people with stories to tell. They'd gone from slaves in Egypt, sojourners in the wilderness, and now were about to be a settled people in the promised land. They were people with a story because they were people with a past. People weighed down by the stones that they carried. From the scars of slavery in Egypt to the stains of their distrust and unfaithfulness in the wilderness, God's people were weighed down by their past. But God says, no more. Here, on the banks of the Jordan River, on the edges of the promised land, no more. It's time to set down your stones and to take up your story as people of God. These 12 stones that the Israelites carried up out of the riverbed were to be set as a reminder of all that they had come through. Very literally. The instructions were clear. These stones were to be brought up from the riverbed, the dry land that the people crossed, to be a physical reminder of how God had brought them up from the land of Egypt, through the waters of the Red Sea, and now across the Jordan River. It was important for the people to have this reminder, especially at this moment, on this day of new beginnings, for the days and the weeks and the years ahead. Because just because they were entering the promised land didn't mean their life was suddenly going to be a piece of cake flowing with milk and honey. It's not how life is. There would be challenges, times of doubt, moments of unfaithfulness. But when those times came, when they began to doubt who they were or who the God is that they served, the stones would be there. The stones would be there to call them to remember all that God had done for them. They would remember the story of who they were, where they had been, and what had been promised to them. These stones were as much a sign of their past as they were a sign to their future. See, the stones held the stories of God's deliverance and steadfast love. The memorial of stacked stone held the stories of all the tribes. It was a reminder that despite all their differences, they were one people. Each tribe had a stone. Each tribe was represented. Again, God's instructions were pretty clear. It wasn't about grabbing some random rocks and throwing them together. No. God said one representative from each tribe was to choose a stone to mark this moment and to serve as a reminder for future generations. The memorial purposely had 12 distinct stones so that anyone who looked at it would see themselves. They would see their stone. That's me. There. They would see their stone and know that they were part of that beloved community. They would see the stones of their brother and sister tribes and give thanks that God had delivered them all through the waters. The stones we set down and stack up matter because they bear the weight of our stories. Our stories as Christians, as men and women, as Americans. The stories that we have are not always straightforward or one-sided. They are complex. They are multiple. They are stories that are painful as they are powerful, as troubling as they are inspiring. So the question is, what stories are we telling? Are they stories that promote life and speak to the presence of God's grace and steadfast love? Or are they stories of hate and greed? Stories that tear down and promote violence against others? And what stories are we listening to? What voices do we hear? Do the stories that we read and see, do they look and sound like ours, or are they different? Are we seeking to hear and to learn from those who carry different stories than ourselves? And finally, what are the memorials that we look to remind us of who we are? What are the monuments that we are building for future generations? God has called us to set down our stones and to take up our stories. May we live into the fullness of God's story, now and forever. Amen.